"You're in the wrong seat, sir." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They were wrapped in a tone sharp enough to slice through cabin chatter and carry across the first-class aisle like a judgment call. David Brooks paused. 6'2", broad shoulders, fitted navy blazer over a crisp white shirt. He didn't flinch, didn't step back. He simply looked down at the woman in seat 1A, her manicured hand resting atop a Louis Vuitton tote like it was a badge of status. His boarding pass, still warm from the printer, read exactly what he already knew. Delta 1897, Los Angeles to Atlanta. Seat 1A. "No, ma'am," he said calmly, his voice even, professional. "This is my seat." The woman's lips curled into a polite, practiced smile, the kind reserved for explaining things to people who don't understand how things work. She wore a cashmere shawl the color of champagne and makeup that had seen a professional touch. "I'm sure there's been some kind of mix-up," she said. "That's my seat." David didn't argue. He didn't need to. He held up his boarding pass, steady, confident, showing her what the airline system, and truth, had already confirmed. She didn't even glance at it. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, dropped her voice just enough to make the next words feel intimate and poisonous. "Sir, first class is a certain experience. I'm not sure you'd appreciate it." The implication landed hard, deliberate, and unmistakable. 2 rows back, a man in khakis lowered his newspaper. Across the aisle, a young woman lifted her phone slightly higher, not recording, yet, but watching. David could feel the weight of every gaze in the cabin, the quiet shift in air pressure when people stopped pretending not to listen. He inhaled once, then reached above for the call button. A soft chime rang out overhead. And in that moment, Flight 1897 was no longer just a trip across the country. It was about to become a case study in perception, power, and the price of assumption. What happens next? You'll want to stay for this. As the flight attendant approached, David could already see the hesitation in his eyes. Young, maybe late 20s. Polished, polite, trying hard to carry the uniform like a shield. His name tag read, Josh, and his practiced smile faltered just slightly when he registered the 2 people before him. "Is there an issue here?" Josh asked, voice light but tightly wound. Before David could answer, the woman in 1A cut in, voice syrupy sweet. "There seems to be a mix-up," she said, gesturing toward David with a flick of her fingers like she was pointing out an unattended bag. "I'm in this seat." He's confused. David remained silent, letting Josh take it all in. Josh turned to David, then to the boarding pass still in his hand. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, please?" David handed it over without a word. Josh glanced down, and for a brief moment, the truth flickered across his face. Seat 1A, David Brooks. There was no mistake. But then it happened. That pause. That familiar, uncomfortable recalibration. Josh looked from the boarding pass to David's face, and back again. And then the woman leaned in, lowering her voice to a mock confidential whisper, though loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "He doesn't look like a 1A kind of man," she said. David's jaw tightened. Not in anger. In recognition. He'd heard variations of this line before. In boardrooms, at conferences, even in valet lines. It always meant the same thing: you're not supposed to be here. Josh's eyes widened, and for a split second, he looked like he wanted to be anywhere else but here. "I see," Josh said quickly, then smiled too hard. "Let me double-check with the system just to be sure." He walked off with the boarding pass, leaving David standing in the aisle, the air around him dense with quiet judgment. Behind him, someone let out a low chuckle. Not funny. Not friendly. Across the cabin, a man in business casual shook his head as if to say, "Why make it a scene?" David looked at the woman again. Her poise, her confidence, the way she crossed her legs like the seat had always been hers. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was measuring. Measuring the cost of silence, the power of patience, and the weight of every assumption floating through this cabin like invisible luggage. And he knew one thing. This flight wouldn't take off the way anyone expected. Josh returned a few moments later, tablet in hand, wearing the same tight smile that now felt more like a mask than hospitality. David could tell, it wasn't going to be good. "Mr. Brooks," Josh began, keeping his voice low, like this was a delicate negotiation, "it looks like there may have been an internal upgrade error in our system. While your boarding pass says 1A, it's possible the seat was double assigned." David raised an eyebrow. Double assigned. Josh nodded quickly. It happens rarely, but it does happen. The woman in the seat, still not moving, let out a tiny laugh, like someone who'd just been proven right at a dinner party. Josh continued. Now, we do have a very comfortable business class seat available. It's just one row back, extra legroom, premium service. We'd be happy to escort you there now. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I paid for seat 1A, he said simply. Josh hesitated. Of course, sir, and I completely understand. But these things, mistakes, sometimes occur. And rather than hold up the flight, I'm not the one holding anything up, David said. The woman scoffed. Oh, come on. Just take the seat. Some people always have to make a scene. Her words weren't loud, but everyone heard them. The way people do when they're listening on purpose while pretending not to. A man across the aisle shook his head again. Another adjusted his tie and muttered something under his breath. Josh shifted nervously. We just want to resolve this as smoothly as possible. Smoothly? David asked, locking eyes with him. You're asking me to move from the seat I paid for because someone else, who didn't, feels entitled to stay here. Is that smooth, or just convenient? Josh didn't respond. David took a breath, steady and calm. Let me save us all time. I won't be moving. You're welcome to resolve the double assignment however your policies require. But I'm not leaving my seat. Josh's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Then I'll need to bring in my supervisor. David nodded once. That's a good idea. He sat down gently in seat 1C, the aisle across from his, and opened his phone. One message. One line. We've got a 1A situation. Need eyes on Delta 1897. The clock had started ticking. It didn't take long before another uniformed figure approached, older, more composed, with a managerial name tag that read, Rebecca, cabin supervisor. She wore the kind of expression that said she'd seen hundreds of delays and wanted this to be over before it began. Good afternoon, she said, more to the tension in the air than to anyone in particular. Can someone explain what's going on here? Josh stepped forward, voice tight. There's a seating discrepancy. The system has 2 passengers assigned to 1A. David stood slowly, meeting her eye without flinching. There's no discrepancy. My boarding pass says 1A. I paid for 1A. I checked in early, was boarded on time, and found someone else already in my seat. Rebecca took the boarding pass, scanned it quickly, then looked back at the seated woman. Ma'am, can I see your pass as well? The woman's smile stiffened, but she handed it over. Rebecca studied both documents. There was no question. One said 1A. The other said 3D. Ma'am, it appears your seat is actually 3D, Rebecca said gently. Oh, there must be a mistake, the woman replied quickly. I always sit in 1A on this route. I assumed it was mine. David didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Rebecca handed the passes back and took a breath like she was weighing PR risk in real time. Mr. Brooks, she said, we'd be happy to offer you a complimentary upgrade voucher and a seat in business class. We understand the inconvenience and, David cut in. Not with force but finality. I'm not looking for a voucher. I'm looking to sit in the seat I paid for. Silence. Then the woman spoke again, voice rising. This is harassment, she snapped. I've been a loyal Delta customer for 20 years, and now I'm being publicly humiliated? David turned his head slowly, looked her straight in the eye. No one's harassing you, he said calmly. You're sitting in someone else's seat, refusing to move, and now calling it harassment when you're being asked to follow the rules. People in nearby rows were no longer pretending not to listen. A few leaned forward. Someone pulled out a phone. The red light blinked faintly. This is discrimination, the woman added, louder now. Because I'm a woman. That's what this is. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. David let the moment hang before speaking again. Funny, he said. That's exactly what I was about to say. The cabin held its breath. The tension in the cabin had gone from uncomfortable to electric. Passengers who had once looked away were now fully tuned in, phones in hand, eyebrows raised, waiting for what came next. David remained seated in 1C, calm, unbothered on the outside, but behind his eyes, The gears were turning. He'd seen this before. He knew how these moments unfolded, and how quickly public perception could shift with a single sentence. Then, it happened. From across the aisle, a woman leaned forward. Late 30s, sharp blazer, wedding band. She had been silent until now, watching with narrowed eyes and a kind of knowing discomfort. Her voice cut through the air like a match strike. "Excuse me," she said, directing her words to Rebecca. "Do you even know who he is?" Heads turned. Rebecca blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry." The woman nodded toward David. "That man is David Brooks, CEO of Brooks Tech. The same Brooks Tech that powers Delta's biometric boarding systems. You're trying to remove the guy who helped build your entire facial scan platform." A low murmur rippled through the cabin. The man next to her, a quiet type in a gray Patagonia vest, nodded. "She's right. I saw him speak at a conference in DC last spring. He's legit. One of the youngest black CEOs in Fortune 100 history." Rebecca's face changed. Slightly. The kind of subtle recalibration people do when they realize they've misjudged someone very badly, very publicly. Even the woman in seat 1A seemed to pause, her fingers tightening slightly around the armrest. "Mr. Brooks," Rebecca began, her voice softer now. "I." David held up a hand. Not in anger. Just in control. "I'm not here for recognition," he said. "I'm here for the seat I paid for." The woman across the aisle wasn't done. "Exactly," she said. "And if he were anyone else, anyone without a LinkedIn profile or press coverage, this conversation would be going very differently. Which is exactly the problem." That landed hard. David looked at her, offered a quiet nod. "Thank you." In that moment, the narrative shifted. It wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about visibility, power, and the dangerous assumptions people make when they think no one will challenge them. And just like that, the story that had been unfolding quietly at 30,000 feet was no longer under the radar. It was gaining altitude. When the captain walked into the cabin, it was like a silent cue swept through the plane. The murmurs quieted. Phones subtly lowered. All eyes shifted to the man in the crisp navy uniform and gold-striped epaulets, his presence unmistakable. "Good afternoon," he said, with a kind of calm authority that didn't need to ask for respect. It simply carried it. His name tag read Captain Lewis, and he had the steady voice of someone who'd flown through thunderstorms and political turbulence alike. "I've been briefed that there's an issue with seat 1A. Rebecca stepped aside as he approached, her face still trying to recover from the earlier misstep. David stood as the captain addressed him directly. "I'm Captain Lewis," he said, extending a hand. "Mr. Brooks, I presume?" David shook it firmly. "Yes. You have my full attention," the captain added. The words weren't just polite. They were intentional. Everyone heard the shift in tone, the difference between brushing off a passenger and showing up to listen. "I paid for 1A. Checked in early. Followed every rule," David said evenly. "Yet somehow, I've been asked multiple times to vacate the seat, while the person who's occupying it didn't even have the correct boarding pass." Captain Lewis nodded slowly, eyes scanning the cabin like a radar. "Do you have your documents?" David handed him his boarding pass and ID without hesitation. Captain Lewis reviewed them with quiet focus. He didn't rush. When he finished, he turned to Rebecca. "Who authorized the suggestion to move Mr. Brooks?" She hesitated. "I did, sir. Based on preliminary info from Josh and the system." "And did anyone verify the seat assignments before suggesting a downgrade?" Another pause. "Not thoroughly, no." Captain Lewis didn't raise his voice. But his next sentence landed with precision. "That's not acceptable." Then, he looked to the woman still seated in 1A. She had gone noticeably quiet, her posture stiff, like she sensed the wind had shifted. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" She fumbled in her purse, finally producing the pass marked clearly, "Seat 3D." Captain Lewis nodded once. "Then I'm going to ask you, politely and firmly, to move to your assigned seat." The silence in the cabin was the loudest it had been all flight. And David. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just sat back in seat 1A, the one he'd earned, and waited for what came next. Captain Lewis hadn't even made it halfway back to the cockpit when his earpiece crackled with urgency. He paused mid-aisle, pressed a button on his collar. "Go ahead. Captain, this is ground control. We've just received a flag on Flight 1897. Passenger David Brooks has been identified as a high-priority individual tied to our strategic investment portfolio." Captain Lewis stopped walking. "Say that again," he asked, even though he'd heard every word clearly the first time. "Brooks Tech. Facial recognition. AI authentication. He's not just a passenger, he's a primary stakeholder in the security infrastructure we've been beta testing for the entire Delta fleet." There was a beat of silence. Then, also, corporates requesting immediate report on incident handling. They're monitoring in real time. Captain Lewis turned back toward the cabin. The weight of the situation had just changed. Dramatically. Meanwhile, David sat in 1A, quiet but alert. His phone buzzed in his lap. A message from his chief of staff. "Delta HQ just pinged. They're watching. Play it smart." He didn't react outwardly, but inside, everything clicked into place. He knew how this worked. Knew how fast a moment could go from personal discomfort to national headline, especially when public optics met corporate liability. Just then, Captain Lewis re-entered the first-class cabin. His demeanor had shifted, not less professional, but far more precise. He walked straight up to David. "Mr. Brooks," he said, voice lower, more deliberate now. "I've just been updated. I want to personally thank you for the work your company has done for our airline." Around them, the air tightened. David gave a small nod. "We're proud of the partnership." The woman from 1A, now quietly settled into 3D, had stopped pretending to read her magazine. Her eyes flicked between them, confusion giving way to a dawning realization that this was not, in fact, just another man in a suit. Captain Lewis continued. "Please let us know if there's anything we can do to make the rest of your flight more comfortable." And louder, just enough for nearby passengers to hear, he added, "Corporate sends their regards." The shift was complete. People who had once dismissed him now sat straighter in their seats. Faces that had judged him were suddenly curious, cautious. Respect doesn't always arrive with titles. Sometimes it arrives after a silence, broken by truth. David didn't need to say a word. He already had the room. By the time the woman in seat 3D had opened her tablet to check her email, it was already too late. The internet had noticed. Across the country, hashtags like #seat1A, #DeltaBias, and #BrooksOnBoard were trending across X, TikTok, and LinkedIn. A 20-second clip, recorded discreetly by a college student seated in row 4, was racking up views by the tens of thousands. The caption read, "Black exec gets denied his seat in first class. Watch what happens next." Eyes raised, fist medium dark skin tone. It had already crossed 800,000 views by the time the plane left the tarmac. In another clip, someone had caught the moment when Captain Lewis returned to first class and said the words, "Corporate sends their regards." That one was gaining steam on TikTok with a soundtrack from Succession added in post. David Brooks wasn't just a name now, he was a movement. The video cut across demographics. Tech Twitter recognized him from keynote panels, business school alumni chimed in with first-person stories of his leadership, and the Black professional community shared the footage with captions like, "We've all been David. This is why representation matters." She thought he was nobody. She found out. Meanwhile, influencers and news accounts picked it up with sensationalized headlines. Delta almost kicked out the man who built their security system. When the man you doubted owns half the table. On LinkedIn, thought leaders had already begun writing reflections. CEOs of mid-sized tech firms posted about unconscious bias. DEI consultants offered instant analyses. One post simply read, "The seat you tried to deny someone might belong to your next investor." Even Delta's own official account, usually reserved for travel alerts and flight updates, issued a vague but carefully worded statement. "We are aware of an incident aboard Delta Flight 1897 and are conducting a thorough internal review. Delta remains committed to dignity, fairness, and accountability for all passengers." Back on the plane, David's phone buzzed again. Media request from CNBC. CNN's reaching out. Morning shows want interviews. He muted the notifications, leaned back in 1A, and stared out the small oval window as the plane leveled into its cruising altitude. He hadn't said much that day. He hadn't needed to. The world was speaking for him now. And somewhere in the back of the cabin, a woman who once thought she had the upper hand was realizing just how loud silence can become once it hits the internet. As the cabin lights dimmed and the hum of cruising altitude settled over Flight 1897, David Brooks opened his laptop. Not to check earnings reports. Not to respond to the flood of media requests that had turned his inbox into a war zone. He opened a blank document. No filters. No PR spin. Just his voice, his words. He knew how this worked. The story was already out there, being reshaped and shared by thousands of strangers, each adding their own commentary, outrage, or validation. But if he didn't say something soon, on his own terms, it wouldn't be his story anymore. He began to type. Today, I was reminded that for some people, perception still outweighs proof. That no matter how many titles you hold, how many companies you build, how quietly you carry your success, someone will always look at you and see a question mark instead of a period. He paused, exhaled. But I was also reminded that power doesn't come from shouting. It comes from clarity, from knowing who you are when others forget, from staying seated, not just physically, but morally. He added a final line. To those watching this unfold, don't make this about me. Make it about the neighbor, the colleague, the intern, the stranger at the gate. Anyone who's been told, without words, that they don't belong. We do. He hit save, uploaded it to LinkedIn, and kept the comments open. No hashtags. No tagging the airline. No performative mic drop. Just truth. Within minutes, reactions poured in, not just likes and shares, but paragraphs. Executives, flight attendants, everyday travelers. Stories. Confessions. Apologies. The kind of conversation that didn't usually happen unless someone was pushed far enough to say, enough. Across the aisle, a woman in business class leaned forward, catching his eye. Thank you, she said quietly, for saying what so many of us have been carrying. David nodded once. Thank you for listening. Then he did something unexpected. He stood up, turned to face the small crowd of passengers who had quietly gathered around first class, not to watch, but to understand. And he said, I'd be happy to answer your questions. Not as a CEO. Just as a man who finally had enough. And that's when the real conversation began. Farther back in the cabin, Susan Whitmore sat stiffly in seat 3D, her posture rigid, her eyes locked on the seatback screen in front of her, but she wasn't watching anything. Her fingers trembled slightly as she gripped her phone. Notifications were pouring in like a broken dam. Mentions. Comments. Screenshots. Her name was trending, and not in the way she'd always imagined it would be. The video of her refusing to give up seat 1A, the close-up of her saying, he doesn't look like a 1A kind of man, it had all gone viral. And now the replies were cutting deep. This is exactly what microaggression looks like. She really said that out loud? In 2025. Susan Whitmore. Remember that name. HR departments will. The flood wasn't just from strangers. Her phone buzzed again. Text message from HR, Archwell Strategies. Susan, we need to speak the moment you land. Urgent. Another one followed, this time from her team lead. PR has seen the footage. Don't respond to anything. Legal is involved. She tried to steady her breathing, but it came out shallow, shaky. A week ago, she'd been preparing a presentation for a diversity initiative her firm was about to roll out. Now, her name was being used as a case study for everything that initiative claimed to fight. Across the aisle, someone whispered, "Is that her?" Susan shrank in her seat. The hum of the cabin seemed louder now, like judgment wrapped in jet fuel. She opened her email, desperate to find some footing, some normalcy. But at the top of her inbox was a message that ended the illusion. Official notice of internal review, suspension pending. And just like that, her career, her image, her carefully curated identity, was unraveling at 35,000 feet. She looked toward the front of the plane, where David sat calmly, surrounded by passengers now listening to him, not just as a CEO, but as a human being who refused to disappear quietly. For the first time that day, Susan realized something she hadn't before. This wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about accountability. And for once, she wasn't in control of the story. By the time Flight 1897 touched down in Atlanta, the ripple effects of what had unfolded in Cabin 1 had already reached Delta's corporate boardroom. But this wasn't just a damage control memo. It was a turning point. At 7:12 p.m. Eastern, Delta's CEO issued a press release titled, "Beyond Apologies, Our Commitment to Action." The statement began with acknowledgement, clear, direct, and rare in corporate language. Yesterday, a valued passenger, Mr. David Brooks, experienced treatment inconsistent with our company's values. We do not tolerate bias. But beyond saying that, we must prove it. And then came the announcement. The Fair Seating Initiative. Effective immediately, all Delta cabin crew would undergo mandatory training on implicit bias, with a focus on high-stakes customer interactions like upgrades, disputes, and gate assignments. But the part that made headlines? Brooks Tech would partner with Delta to pilot a new AI-powered system designed not just to manage seating logistics, but to flag and analyze patterns of unequal treatment in real time. Subtle trends. Recurring issues. Language that reveals more than it should. It wasn't surveillance, it was accountability. David's voice, firm but hopeful, appeared in the joint press release. We're not building software to punish people. We're building mirrors so that companies can finally see themselves clearly and choose to do better. The reaction was immediate. Airlines across the U.S. began re-evaluating their own protocols. HR departments took notes. News anchors shifted the narrative from scandal to solution. What had started as an uncomfortable moment in Row 1A was now reshaping an entire industry's conversation around power, access, and assumption. On LinkedIn, one comment stood out among the thousands. It took one man refusing to move to make an entire system shift. Inside the aircraft, as passengers gathered their belongings, several paused to shake David's hand. Not just out of admiration, but gratitude. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't made demands. He had simply refused to be erased. And by doing so, he'd reminded everyone on board that change doesn't always start with policy. Sometimes, it starts with a person who chooses to stay seated until justice stands up. As the jet bridge connected and passengers stood to deplane, David Brooks remained in his seat for a moment longer. Not because he was tired, but because he understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is sit still when the world expects you to back down. He watched people pass, some nodding in acknowledgement, some too ashamed to meet his gaze, others still processing what had unfolded over the last few hours. And in that moment, it wasn't about business or headlines or brand strategy. It was about dignity. About how quickly it can be questioned, and how deliberately it must be defended. Here's the truth no policy can fully cover. Every day, each of us is offered a seat. Sometimes it's in a boardroom. Sometimes it's on a bus. Sometimes it's in a conversation that feels uncomfortable but necessary. And in those moments, we're given a choice, not just where to sit, but how to show up. You don't have to be a CEO to draw a line. You don't need millions of followers to have a voice. You just need clarity. The clarity to know that when someone says, "You don't look like you belong here," the problem isn't you, it's the lens they're looking through. David didn't become a symbol of quiet resistance because he had power. He became one because he remembered something we often forget. Silence isn't always neutral. Sometimes, it protects the loudest liar in the room. And sometimes, it's mistaken for agreement by people who desperately need to be corrected. So here's the life application. The real takeaway from Seat 1A. When you see bias, speak. When you hear injustice, question it. When you're told you don't belong, prove them wrong by staying exactly where you are. Because the seat someone tries to deny you today, it might be the one that teaches the entire room what it means to lead with dignity tomorrow. And if you're lucky, it'll start a conversation far bigger than yourself. One seat, one story, one decision to stay. And everything begins to shift.